Hello everybody and welcome to Key History, a brand new channel, and with that a brand new series called Key History Made Easy, where we'll be taking a look at key events, battles and people of the past and condensing all the information down on one topic to bring you one clear and easy to follow history. In today's video, the first video in this series, we are going to be taking a look at the Battle of the Somme 1916. As I'm sure you have heard before, this is regarded as one of the bloodiest conflicts in world history and is still a topic of much debate today on who was to blame for the cost of what was achieved during those nightmarish months in France. But the purpose of this video is to give you the who, what, where, why and when of the Battle of the Somme, an overview of what happened and why. Everything I've included in this video I believe to be key to the narrative of the battle. However, there are many smaller battles that I have not mentioned. This is not because they are less important, but to give a good overview of the topic, I have had to leave some things out, else this video would become incredibly long. So before we begin getting into the objectives and the commanders and the timeline of the Somme, we have some quite shocking numbers here that will coincide with the events of the Somme and will set the tone, really, of the battle before we begin. So prior to the 1st of July, in 7 days, 1.5 million artillery shells were fired on the German lines at the Somme. 30% of these shells did not explode. 57,000 British casualties were taken on the very first day, 19,000 of which were killed. 60% of British officers involved on the 1st of July died that very same day. In total, you had 141 days of fighting from the 1st of July to the 18th of November. 1.6 million approximate casualties on all sides, the British, the German and the French. 419,000 British casualties, 200,000 French killed and 500,000 German troops were killed at the Battle of the Somme. All of this for 6 miles in territory taken by the British forces at the Somme. During this horrific time, 49 Victoria Cross awards were given for valour and bravery during the battle. From these numbers, we can see that the Battle of the Somme was more than just a quick and fierce battle that it had been intended by the commanders. In reality, it turned out to be a ferocious, drawn-out war of attrition, a type of war that only one side was really ready for. Attritional warfare is different to any wars that had been seen prior to this, the American War of Independence, the Civil War, etc. And this was because this was the first time that three huge industrial powers were throwing everything they had at each other in terms of men and machine. Dug out fighting. They were fighting from trench line to trench line. It was not glorious charges. It was bitter fighting for yards and meters. So now we must ask why. Why did the Battle of the Somme take place? Why was there a need for a large-scale Allied attack in the Picardy region of France? In 1916, the German forces chose to attack at the Verdun region, drawing most of, if not all of France's men and attention into one large-scale defence, holding the ground against the onslaught of the advancing German army. After 4 months of fighting against what seemed impossible odds, the French army were at breaking point. The French commander, Joseph Joffre, requested a second front to reduce the pressure on the French. Haig, the British commander on the Somme, and Joffre, the French field commander, agreed that the British needed to play a larger part in the war, and opening another front to the east on the River Somme would ease the pressure on the French forces tied down at Verdun. The plan for the Battle of the Somme had 2 very clear objectives. 1, to relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun, and 2, to inflict as heavy losses as possible on the German soldiers and exhaust German resources and reserves. The plan was for Haig to attack in the middle of 1916, however Haig opposed this as he wanted to wait until later in the year in order to build up the men, the supplies and the artillery of the British Expeditionary Force before such a massive attack. This was rejected as Joffre urged him to attack sooner as the French could simply not hold out any longer at Verdun. Sir Henry Rawlinson's first plan of attack was criticised by Haig for being far too unambitious. Haig believed that the army should aim for targets much further into the German-held positions and on a much wider front, spreading the supplies and the men of the British Expeditionary Force even thinner than they already were. The British Fourth Army was to capture 27,000 yards of the German first line from Montauban to Sierre, and then the Third Army was to mount a diversionary attack at Gommecourt. In the second phase of the battle, the Fourth Army was to take the German second position from Pozières to the Ancre, and then the second position south of the Elbe-Bapaume road, ready for an attack on the German third position south of the road towards Flers, when the reserve army, which included 3 cavalry divisions, would exploit the successes and advance east and then north to Arras. The Somme was Britain's first major battle in the war. From 1914 to 1915, the British Expeditionary Force had been a small and entirely professional force, but the Somme was to be the first time that Lord Kitchener's conscripted PALS battalions would be put to the test. These were named due to the fact that they were battalions made up from men who would have joined, trained, and then fight together in the trenches, all from one local area. The French would attack on a smaller area to the south of the British line, in an area that is widely regarded to have less fierce German defences. However, they were still very formidable and by no means a walk in the park. The French Sixth Army, with 1 corps on the north bank from Maricourt to the Somme, and 2 corps on the south bank towards Fauquecourt, would make a subsidiary attack to guard the right flank of the main attack being made by the British. By this point, the French were already having to pull earmarked forces away from what would have been the Somme to throw into holding the line at Verdun. It was originally intended that the Battle of the Somme would be a French-led attack, with the British as the supporting force. However, this was quickly being turned the other way. The British were now in the driving seat, and Lord Kitchener warned Haig to be wary of his French counterpart, as it seems that he was all but too happy to allow the British to do all of the hard work in the progressed liberation of France. Now, before we go any further, I feel like it's very important to put faces to the names of these people who I keep throwing around: Haig, Rawlinson, and Joffre. General Sir Henry Rawlinson was Haig's second in command for the Somme, and much more tactically adept. Rawlinson's plan for the battle was to allow the heavy artillery to blast away at the German lines to clear the way for a small infantry assault on achievable objectives in a bite and hold tactic aimed to snatch and hold ground taken from the Germans piece by piece. Rawlinson was ready to fight the war of attrition that the Somme would eventually require. General Sir Douglas Haig was the absolute top dog for the British forces in France. He was the field commander on the Western Front for most of World War I and during the Somme. He was a cavalryman who struggled to come to terms with the new 20th century styles of war that the Somme would unleash. He still believed that big breakthroughs were made and exploited by large units of mounted riders punching through holes made by the artillery. This, of course, would prove fatal for so many later. He believed that Rawlinson's initial plan was far too cautious, and with his plan he stretched out the attack to a much wider front, meaning the artillery would be further stretched and by this reducing its effectiveness. Haig was so confident that the artillery would clear the way that he had 2 full cavalry divisions on standby ready to chase down the fleeing Germans. Joseph Joffre was Haig's French counterpart on the Somme. He was the French field commander for the entire Somme campaign and would control the area south of the British line. Joffre was like Haig in many respects, an old-school commander trying to fight a 20th century war. Joffre was also not a good tactical mind. However, he was a master of logistics. He oversaw the movement of some 2 million French soldiers and supplies to the front lines during the war, which enabled the French artillery and men, among other reasons, to be far more effective than those of the British. Joffre's biggest asset was his general Ferdinand Foch, who was adept in artillery and infantry deployment, which eventually led to the success of the French sector, due to more accurate and higher quality shelling of the German front line. Now we can move on to the key battles and timelines of the Somme. The 1st of July is known for being the bloodiest day in military history. After 7 days of artillery bombardment, which Haig believed would be enough to have devastated the German front lines, the whistle blew for the men of the British Expeditionary Force's PALS battalions to go over the top. Many of these men were seeing battle for the first time, and they were grossly unprepared. The shells that had been falling on the German line had been ineffective at best. Many of these had been shrapnel shells, designed for taking out large swaths of infantry, and not the meters and meters of German wire, which they had left uncut. The heavy explosive shells that were used had proven ineffective against the deep and well-constructed German dugouts, and to make things worse, 1/3 of these heavy explosive shells that fell did so as duds. By the end of the week-long barrage, the Germans knew that this would mark the start of the infantry assault, so when the artillery lifted, they came out of their dugouts and manned their far superior machine guns, the Maschinengewehr 80s, and cut down entire communities of men. Many of the generals, including Haig, believed that the new PALS battalions, not being ready for war, would charge forward and subsequently lose contact with those behind them and be cut off. This is one of the main reasons that the men of the British Expeditionary Force were given possibly one of the most famous and costly orders of the war, to walk across no man's land in densely packed ranks. However, we must consider, was there any other choice? During the battle, the men were often cut off after advancing forward due to the German counter-artillery, throwing down iron curtains of fire, destroying phone cables, and forcing the Allies to chance human runners in the maelstrom. On the first day, however, there were some successes. The 18th and the 30th Divisions managed to take all of their objectives. The 7th Division captured Mametz, and the 36th Ulster Division captured Schwaben Redoubt. However, they had to later withdraw. The objectives for the first day, Seer and Baume-Hamel, were not taken until the very, very last weeks of the war. The total casualties for the first day were 57,000. Now we go to the 2nd to the 13th of July, and before we move on, I would just like to take the time to apologise in case I crucify any of these French villages and towns and German given names to strong points, etc., because I absolutely will. Rawlinson's 4th Army now pushed for Troneswood, Mametzwood, Contalmaison, and the Leipzig Redoubt. This was to cover the flanks of an assault made on the German 2nd position at 3:25 am the next morning, converging on Bazentin-le-Petit, Troneswood, and Longueval. The attacks on the 14th of July marked the beginning of a series of vicious attacks and counter-attacks by the German and Allied forces at Highwood and Delvillewood, which the Germans would hold until the 27th of August. Now jumping ahead a little bit to the 23rd of July and the second major phase of the Somme. The British Reserve Army under the command of General Sir Hubert Gough moved to attack the area around the village of Pozières, which would serve as an alternate approach to the rear of Thiepval, a continuing German strongpoint and a thorn in the side of High Command. The French organised a cooperative attack towards Péronne with the assistance of a British attack at Guillemont and Gonchy, though neither of these fell until early September. This is the first time that the German command needed to pull troops away from the Battle of Verdun to throw into holding the line at the Somme. Here we can see the two connecting front lines of the British and the French forces on the Somme at the end of July. We can see there Gonchy and Guillemont and Delvillewood still holding out as German strongpoints. The significance of this is that the British Expeditionary Force were fighting both figuratively and literally shoulder to shoulder with the French forces to push back the German invaders. This is the first time a joint operation on this scale had ever been seen. The British line headed west towards Albert, then turned north alongside a little river called the Ancre. In mid-1916, the British and French lines on the Western Front met just above the River Somme near the village of Maricourt. The French line headed south of the Somme into less but still formidable German defensive positions. This map illustrates part of the British line around Thiepval, Pozières, Olivers, Martinpuich and Courcelette, illustrating the shift and the progress that the Allied made from the 1st of July to the end. Here we can see that Thiepval still remains a critical German strong point. The Leipzig salient defensive positions were constructed in 1915 are still holding out, even though that the line further west has surpassed them. By the 14th of July 1916, the area that you can see here, just above Contalmaison and just below Pozières, stood at roughly 6,000 yards. Now, between the 4th of August and the 15th of September, heavy fighting continues in both the British and the French sectors. There is good progress made on Pozières, west and south of Guillemont, Ginchy, Thiepval, and Delville Wood, which was captured in this time. French troops take the area south of Combres as far as the River Somme. By the end of the 4th of August, the Allies had gained much of their German second defence line. This stood on a frontage of around 2,000 yards. It is also worth mentioning here that the German attacks on Verdun were now being successfully repulsed as the French line stiffened due to the German attention being successfully diverted away from Verdun and onto the Somme. Now we move on to the third clear-cut phase of the Somme, and into one of the most discussed turning points of the struggle, the introduction of the tank. Nothing like this had been seen in a theatre of war ever. The battle for supremacy in the skies was still young, with planes being constructed from wood, cloth and a little metal, but now the German, British and French soldiers alike were seeing these iron beasts on the Western Front for the very first time. Before we talk about what they achieved on the Somme, let's talk about what they could do and how they were armed. The Mark I, the male, was 28 tons, the female weighing in a ton lighter. They were both 32 feet and 6 inches long with a steering tail attached to the back. The crew consisted of 8. You had 1 commander, 1 brakesman, 1 driver, 2 gearsmen and 4 gunners, with armour of 0.24 to 0.47 inches thick. The male was equipped with 2 Hotchkiss ordnance quick-firing 6-pounder cannons and 3.303-inch Hotchkiss machine guns, whereas the female was equipped with 4.303-inch Vickers machine guns and 1 303-inch Hotchkiss machine gun, with a top speed averaging from 1 to 4 miles per hour. The 15th of September saw mixed results for the tank. 2,000 to 3,000 yards were gained on a 6-mile front, much more than had been gained in previous days. Captured ground due to the tanks stood at Flers, Martinpuich, Courcelette, Highwood, Guedgard, Le Boeuf and Morval. French attacks on the same day pushed on to the south of Rancourt and captured a system of trenches north of the Perez farm. But why did Haig use the tank when he only had a handful? After 2 months of constant slaughter that had already taken place on the Somme, Haig was in need of a decisive blow to justify his campaign on the Somme, not only to the politicians in Whitehall, but to his men on the ground. Opposition was already mounting against Haig back in London, particularly led by Winston Churchill. But by this point, the men's morale was at an all-time low. Fighting had slowed and the ground was now impassable by foot due to heavy rain, making the bringing up of supplies, artillery and more men to relieve those in the front line much harder. Sitting in waist-high, freezing water in the trenches, men were now losing the will to fight. The tanks, like the original attack, were spread much too thinly across a too great an area to be truly devastating. Of the 49 available, only 39 reached their starting positions. When the attack began, many broke down or became stuck in the thick, gloopy mud, so only a total of 18 took part effectively. Of these 18, only 9 managed to reach the German lines. Many were lost in the attack due to bullets or shells striking the exposed fuel lines, igniting everything inside. Due to the speed of the tanks, it was impossible for them to spearhead the attack, and many had to move behind or alongside the infantry, which greatly reduced their effectiveness. In the confusion of battle, some even lost their way, and there were reports of tanks firing on their own men. However, those that did break through devastated the enemy. The German forces, seeing the tanks for the first time, did not know how to stop such a thing, and indeed pulled back and fled, as one might expect when coming face to face with a tank for the very first time. So we can ask ourselves, were the tanks used effectively? Not really. Many people, including Churchill, criticised Haig for using the tank too early and squandering the element of surprise. But on the other hand, many believed that it had been a valuable tryout for the tank. Could Haig have waited for more tanks to be ready? Yes and no. His hand was forced. He did waste the element of surprise and reduce the initial impact they could have had, but he was desperate for something to turn the tide of the battle. He had a choice. Should he use the tanks he has and attempt to break through attack, or does he wait for more to be ready, during which time more and more units of men will be forced into the meat grinder of the Somme? He was so impressed with the performance of the tank that Haig immediately ordered 1,000 more to be sent to France right away. Did Haig have a choice when to use the tank? Again, no. Now we have to ask ourselves, was the tank attack a success? Some successes were achieved, yes. However, they were used on too wide a front, and they were used as an infantry support vehicle instead of spearheading attacks themselves. Crews were inadequately trained due to lack of time. Poor battlefield conditions rendered it almost impossible for even a tank to move up and down, and poor reliability and poor durability of the tank hindered them further. By September 18th, the Allies had gained some formidable German strongpoints along the front. Flers, Martinpuich, Highwood, Delville Wood, Ginchy, Mouquet Farm and Mametz Wood had all fallen by this point. By September 19th, Haig believed that the battle should continue regardless, either until there is a shortage of men or the weather makes it too difficult to fight. During this time, opposition to Haig and the Somme grows as a whole, spearheaded by the soon-to-be Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Statements such as this show potentially a lack of empathy by Haig for his men in the line, or it could be argued that they show a willingness and an understanding that the job must be done and men will die in war. During this time, the British made successful attacks at Le Boeuf and Morval, while the French made successful attacks at Rancourt, La Perez Farm, Fricourt and Morval. The British attacked the Schwaben redoubt at the crest of the Thiepval Plateau, but this would not completely fall until October 14th. Thiepval would also fall on the 26th of September, which marked the beginning of the battle for Thiepval Ridge. On this same day, the British forces would also storm Gueudecourt. By the 1st of October, conditions on the battlefield are now becoming a persistent issue. Troop and supply movement was now impossible, and this also meant that the collection of the dead and dying was impossible. Those who were dying had to be left in no man's land, with the already past piling up around them, creating a horrific swamp of dead, dying and mud. Rawlinson notes in his diary at this point that he is now considering calling off the operations of the Somme due to the weather, as moving ammunition and artillery is now slowly grinding to a halt. During this time, the French forces finally occupy all of Verdun again. The Battle of the Ancre begins. Beaumont-Hamel is stormed and taken by the 5th Highlanders, and Saint-Péry-de-Vion is captured and 3,000 German prisoners of war are taken. Between the 14th of November and the 18th, the British managed to capture Beaucourt, and then they advanced to the east of Butte de Walencourt. They also managed to advance to the north and the south of the Ancre, and they reached the surrounding areas of Grandcourt. The final phase objectives were to capture Beaumont-Hamel and Serre which had been British objectives from the very first assault. German prisoners for this time amounted to some 5,200. By November 18th, operations on the Somme are brought to a close and the Somme offensive is officially over. Now we move on to Haig versus David Lloyd George. Haig strongly believed that his attack had been a success, regardless of the loss of life that it incurred. Quote, Verdun had been relieved, the main German forces had been held on the Western Front, and the enemy's strength had been very considerably worn down. Any one of these three results in itself sufficiently justifies the Somme battle. The attainment of all three of them affords ample compensation for the splendid efforts of our troops and for the sacrifices made by ourselves and our allies. They have brought us a long step forward towards the final victory of the Allied cause. Now, David Lloyd George, soon to be Prime Minister, disagreed strongly. He believed that the Somme had been an utter waste of life and a poorly executed attack stemming from Haig himself. Quote, over 400,000 of our men fell in this bull-headed fight, and the slaughter amongst our young officers was appalling. For the disastrous loss of the finest manhood of the United Kingdom and Ireland, there was only a small gain of ground to show. The losses sustained were not only heavy, but irreplaceable. Had it not been for the inexplicable stupidity of the Germans in provoking a quarrel with America and bringing that mighty people into the war against them, just as they had succeeded in eliminating another powerful foe, Russia, the Somme would not have saved us from the inextricable stalemate. Now, we can see here that there was opposition to the Somme even after it had ended and arguably achieved its objectives. Now, moving on to comparing the British and the French attacks on the Somme. Who was more effective and how or not they achieved their objectives? The French artillery was far superior to the British and was thusly capable of much more advanced tactics, such as counter-battery, which was targeting German artillery shells from where they fell and where they were fired from, and the creeping barrage. This was because the French army was made up of highly professional soldiers who had had experience fighting on the Western Front for 2 years, even before the Somme. Because of this experience, the French heavy explosive shells that landed in the German front line caved in the German dugouts and effectively cut the German wire in front of the trenches. This meant that the French infantry were able to spend less time in no man's land and more time pushing into the German positions. Because of the success of the artillery, the French command far less criticism than their British counterparts. Fewer losses were taken in the French sector, and similar or greater successes were achieved. It is worth mentioning that the German defensive positions in the French sector to the south of the Somme were not as well dug in and less heavily manned than those in the British sector. Due to all of these factors, the French suffered a total loss of around 200,000 men during the conflict. The British on the Somme, on the other hand, were not at their best fighting strength. The artillery units, which we know were vital to the new 20th century style of waging war, were too few and far between on the Somme. Even then, many of the artillery battalions were made up of the 4th Army, the conscripted PALS battalions, and not those of the professional soldiers, as we mentioned the French were. Even the shells being fired from these guns were inferior to the French. Much fewer heavy explosive shells were available to use in the British sectors of the Somme, so the advancing infantry ran into German men and defences very much intact, thusly suffering many more casualties. It's worth mentioning here that the raiding parties before the main attacks reported back that the German wire had been uncut by the artillery, but Haig and Rawlinson continued with attacks, believing that the artillery had definitely done its job. The British also struggled on the Somme due to the size of the task it was asking of her men. By 1916, the British Army stood at close to 1.5 million men. However, only around 300,000 of these were professional soldiers. The rest were the Pals battalions, made up of local men just trying to do their part for king and country. The German forces on the Somme could not have been more of an opposite to this. They were well equipped, well trained, and delusional about the ideological need for this war and the victory that Germany needed. The German army had been digging in on the Somme for almost 2 years, so pitting barely trained British workmen up against one of the most professional armies the world has ever seen. Haig managed to both underestimate and overestimate the average British soldier during the Somme. The overestimation being their outlandish first day objectives and the effectiveness of the artillery barrage, whereas he managed to also underestimate them in the first day of the Somme attack when asking them to simply walk towards German lines, believing they would lose contact with each other and become disorientated. This happened again later in the Somme by not allowing his generals to order attacks that exploited gains made in the previous, much larger assaults. This mismanagement of men and general poor leadership can be held accountable as to why the loss of life on the Somme was so heavy. By the end of the Somme campaign, the British conscript soldier had changed and was now much adept with battle and was able to handle the finer details of military tactics, which inevitably led to a greater success as the Battle of the Somme progressed. Conclusions for the Battle of the Somme. Was it worth it? The British had advanced a total of 6 miles deep by 20 miles long. The French took similar gains, but for around about half the casualties. The German casualties on the Somme, the exact number is a little bit harder to pin down, but it ranges from around 600,000 to roughly 720,000 men. Despite the losses of the battle, the Somme had been entirely necessary. The French line at Verdun was at breaking point, and it could not have held out any longer without a second front being opened. The largest problem that faced those fighting on the Allied Somme was the leadership. Now, it is easy to say that the leadership was inadequate, and an argument for that is, what would you do if you were in that position with no modern technology, etc.? But there are exceptions. Tactical errors were made, and men were sent to slaughter effectively. The biggest failure of the Somme has to be the cost of what was achieved. The total losses stood at around 1.3 to 1.6 million men. Okay, so that is it. We have talked about the why, what, when, where, how and who of the Somme. I hope this has given you a decent overview of the battle and what happened all those years ago in France. Thank you very, very much for watching. If you have any suggestions, comments or concerns, please leave them in the comment box. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing for more content like this. This has been Key History Made Easy, the Battle of the Somme, 1916.